American Literature Supplement, Lesson 7, Part 3, Phillis Wheatley. Born in 1753 in Africa, 7-year-old Phillis Wheatley was kidnapped. Sold to a prosperous Boston family, the Wheatleys. While nothing could soften the horrors of slavery, the Wheatleys family was very kind to her. They valued her sharp mind, taught her grammar and writing. The Wheatley family were born-again Christians. Therefore, it was not surprising that Phillis Wheatley committed her life to Christ and came to know the Bible well. At the same time, three English Christian poets, Milton, Pope, and Gray, touched her deeply and exerted a strong influence on her verse. She became a sensation in Boston in the 1760s when her poem on the death of a great evangelist, George Whitefield, was circulated. Phillis Wheatley was one of the earliest African American evangelists. She argued that all men and women, regardless of race or class, were in need of salvation. In the following poem, she advises students at Harvard College that knowing Jesus is more important than any other knowledge, and that sin is their greatest foe and should be shunned. To the University of Cambridge and New England, Harvard College. Students, to you 'tis given to scan the heights above, to traverse the ethereal space, and mark the systems of revolving worlds. Still more, ye sons of science, ye receive the blissful news by messengers from heaven, how Jesus' blood for your redemption flows. See him with hands outstretched upon the cross, immense compassion in his bosom glows. He hears revilers, nor resents their scorn. What matchless mercy is the Son of God! When the whole human race by sin had fallen, he deigned to die that they might rise again, and share within the sublimest skies life without death and glory without end. Improve your privilege while they stay, ye pupils, and each hour redeem that bears or good or bad report of you in heaven. Let sin, that banful evil to the soul, by you be shunned, nor once remit your guard. Suppress the deadly serpent in its egg, ye blooming plants of human race divine. And Ethiop tells you 'tis your greatest foe. Its transient sweetness turns to endless pain, and immense perdition sinks the soul. By the time Phillis Wheatley wrote her poetry, slavery had existed in the American colonies for more than 160 years. In fact, the institution of slavery had existed in Western civilization since biblical times, but the first slaves came to the Western Hemisphere in the early 1500s. However, not until 20 African slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 was slavery present in America. In fact, it was not altogether clear if the first African slaves were brought as indentured servants to be released in 7 years, or chattel servants never to be released. Nevertheless, it quickly became a moot point. A series of complex colonial laws made sure that Africans and their descendants were to remain in slavery for perpetuity. What came first, racism or slavery? It's hard to say, but racism was not institutionalized in America until white Americans created a language to describe American people groups. When in 1619 the first African American came to the Jamestown colony, that language was already present. Europeans from the 1200s and early 1500s used terms such as Negro to refer to persons with dark-colored skin. Initially, these terms were used not to degenerate a race or caste, nor were they used in a genealogical sense. They were used to designate a different physical attribute. Later, Negro and mulatto gained a negative connotation. As white Americans learned to name minorities, a system of control arose, resulting in racism. Racism, with all its stereotyping components, evolved into the depreciating form in which it exists today. The historian David R. Roediger argues the idea of race then emerges from the ways that social meaning becomes attached to physical differences. White Europeans gave such meaning an inherent God-given origin, and white Americans kept up the tradition. Blackness was considered to be a disease. The rhetoric of disease was a critical component in white American racism. White Americans loved to frame their racism in scientific terms. One favorite theory was that the skin color and facial features of the black were the result of congenital leprosy. Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry saw black people as the greatest threat to the public health in 18th century America. Rush argued that the black skin of African Americans was the result of a form of leprosy. Contemporary racist literature authenticated these racist stereotypes and maintained them in American language. Most slaves were taken from West Africa. There is little doubt that Phillis Wheatley came from this area. The African American historian Benjamin Quarles described these West African people groups. Of the varied Old World people that entered America, none came with as wide a geographical area as the blacks. The vast majority came from the west coast of Africa, a 3,000-mile stretch extending from the Senegal River to Angola. These groups shared no common language. Indeed, there are more than 200 distinct languages in present-day Nigeria alone. There is no such thing as the African personality, since the varied groups differed as much as their way of life as in their physical characteristics they exhibited. Whatever the type of society, the different groups of Africans all operated under well-organized social systems. African societies before the coming of the Europeans were not backwards and changeless. Quarles also described slave trading in the Middle Passage. Normally, European settlers established forts on the edge of the jungle. The Africans wishing to obtain the trade goods would capture young men and women and take them to the fort. The terror is unimaginable. African young people were stolen from their families and were never seen again. The slaves were kept in makeshift prisons or warehouses until their proprietor had enough to justify a shipment, which was about 250. One of the most awful parts of slavery was the Middle Passage. Imagine being stolen from everything familiar, from everyone you loved, placed in a dark prison, perhaps raped and abused, and then chained side to side naked with hundreds of strangers, all of all ages, sexes, inside this dark ship. Imagine lying in your own waste for 6 weeks, hear the cries of anguish and death, and smell the result of human sin. Phillis Wheatley experienced this Middle Passage, and yet no invectiveness survives in her writing. The South Atlantic Trade Network involved several international routes. The best known of the triangular trade included the transportation of manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, where they were traded for slaves. Slaves were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean, the infamous Middle Passage, primarily to Brazil and the Caribbean, where they were sold. Up to 1/8 of human cargo died, but profits were so vast that the loss was considered to be incidental. Often the slaves would stay in the West Indies for several weeks while they were acclimated to their new North American home. The final leg of this triangular trade brought tropical products to Europe. In another variation, manufactured goods from colonial America were taken to West Africa. Slaves were carried to the Caribbean and southern colonies, and sugar, molasses, and other goods were returned to the home ports. A basic step toward successful slave management was the implant in the slaves an identity of personal inferiority. They had to keep their place to understand that bondage was their natural status. Thus, from the beginning, Africans understood that their resistance to white domination was a question of identity survival. Indeed, resistance seemed to be the only way to survive in the face of profound white systematic racism. It was from this root that later separatism ideology sprang. However, Africans began to resist even before they were out of sight of Africa. Resistance became a way of life, whether it was in the colonial South Carolina Stonewall Rebellion or in Brer Rabbit story or in the everyday work in the cotton fields. African Americans resisted. Slaves defiantly cut off the roots of the plants with their hoes just under the ground so no one noticed. Slaves used work stoppages, self-injuries, and, especially in the first few weeks of bondage, suicide to resist white enslavement. African Americans were resisting so vigorously that at times it seemed as if a white minority was under siege. One of the cleverest ways the African Americans resisted the whites was by their maintenance of a rich culture. This pattern of behavior continued into the 20th century. Numbers and size of African American communities affected the degree and nature of resistance. But resistance existed. A chasm grew between the white and African Americans that politics, religion, and economics would never bridge. This chasm, real or imagined, became an indelible part of the American ethos. In summary, the dominant white community did not allow the African American community to express overtly their frustration. Therefore, the African American slave community used the folk tale to express hostility toward their masters, impart wisdom to the young, and teach survival skills. In the folk tale of Tarbaby Tricks Briar Rabbit, Briar Rabbit slyly convinces his arch enemy, Fox and Bear, to throw him into the briar patch rather than into the well. Of course, that's exactly what Briar and Fox do, and exactly what Briar Rabbit wants them to do. For then Briar Rabbit escapes through the briar patch. The African American slave community resisted slavery in every possible way. From the beginning of the African community saw itself as an adversarial role in the white community and has sought to escape into its own culture as a way to defend itself against white domination. African American slaves stayed aloof from the white world. This was especially true in their religious life. Many African American church leaders resisted assimilation into church institutions in which whites participated. In this fundamental way, African Americans showed their defiance. In fact, the early civil rights movement, to many observers, appeared to be a religious protest movement more than a political protest movement. Within the context of chattel slavery, the African American community created patterns of resistance that remain today. Resistance, not accommodation, not abdication, was the behavioral outcome of 300 years of white American prejudice. The following is a letter by Phillis Wheatley to George Washington. To His Excellency General Washington. Sir, I have taken the freedom to address Your Excellency in the enclosed poem, and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. Your being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the Army of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excite sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your Excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am your Excellency's most obedient humble servant, Phillis Wheatley.